Good morning, everybody. Those that were here yesterday, welcome back. Those that are new today, welcome. Just a few announcements as usual. We have classes here, God willing, every morning. So every Monday is Maimonides. Every Tuesday is Everyday Ethics. Every Wednesday is Historical Sketches. Every Thursday is Jewish Psychology. Friday is Kabbalah and Meditation. And Saturday we have services at 9:30, followed by a full sit-down Kiddush. So please join us for that. Friday afternoon at 12:15, we have the challah baking class. So join us for that as well. You walk away with your own challah. That's the most popular thing in Shatar. Okay. So what are we going to be talking about today? Everyday ethics. What we usually do is we present an everyday kind of common question and take a few minutes to discuss what you feel is the right thing, the proper thing, the ethical thing to be done in that situation, what you would do. And then we examine the Judaic texts to give us some principles, some guiding principles. Nothing is definitive, of course, every situation is unique, but just to give us some ideas with which to process. So the example that we're going to use today, again, we're going to use a specific example, but think a little looser. Think about the concept more than the example per se. So one of the most common things in life is that we take out at some point or another a loan, especially when the rates are low and so on. But actually in Judaism, there is a mitzvah. There's a mitzvah to loan people money without taking interest. Now, of course, not always do you have that opportunity. You have to go to the institutions to take out with interest. But it's actually a mitzvah if you do have the ability to help somebody out with a loan without interest. That is actually one of the greatest forms of charity, because this way they don't feel they're taking charity, they're paying you back, but at the same time it's without the interest. So you're giving them an opportunity to really rebuild themselves. So what happens quite often, and there's at least in religious and Orthodox communities, there are organizations called Gemach, which is they offer free interest loans, but also individuals feel that it's a mitzvah, it's a, as people call it, a good deed. And so if you have money sitting and somebody else is in need, and they'll ask you for a loan, you offer them that loan. So we'll use an example of not an institutionalized loan, because that goes through, of course, the legal system. We'll talk about it on a personal level. So you needed a large loan, and a good friend of yours offered to loan you that amount of money. But at the same time, as the Talmud says, any wise person doesn't just give a loan, you have to have collateral, that witnesses, but at least minimal collateral. So this way you have some type of security, some type of, you can even say proof that you've given the loan, proof that you haven't received payment on the loan, but also that you have some type of security that you could fall back onto. So in this particular example, we'll use, you needed a large loan. Your friend says, I'm willing to give it to you, but what collateral are you going to offer me? So you tell them, well, look, I have a second home, what we call in New York, a bungalow out in the Catskills. So you have a bungalow. It's a second home. It's not obviously worth what a home is worth in the city. And you say, you know what, here, I'll write over the deed to you. And this way you have collateral, my bungalow. Time passes, time of payment comes, and you don't have the full amount of money to pay. And the lender comes and says, no, time to pay up. You say, you know what, just take the bungalow. And you're excited, actually, because you're always looking for a bungalow. It happens to be in a good colony, in a good community. And you say, you know what, okay, I'm going to take it. But 3 days later, it hits you. What did I just do? This is where my family goes for the summer. This is the community that they're accustomed to for so many years. So you go back to the lender, you say, you know what, here, I got the money together. Take the money, give me back the deed. He says, no, I'm happy with the bungalow. You say, but I didn't mean it. I had nothing to give you. So but I have it. I didn't really mean to give you the bunk. What's the right thing to do? And again, this is just a broad example. You can translate it in any type of example where you're offering the other party to keep the collateral, and then a short while later you retract and you offer them cash, and you want it back, and the other person wants, for whatever reason, they want that particular collateral. Do they have to give it back and accept the cash, or is it theirs and it's too late? What do you feel? Anybody?
Well, I believe in New York there are laws that require you have a period of 5 to 10 days to reverse a financial transaction that magnitude. But I think that's only a matter of the magnitude of the transaction.
Okay, so if there's a legal system obviously in place that mandates one way or another, and that is the custom practice, then obviously we abide by that. And the simple reason is not only because it's the legal system, but also because on an ethical level, we assume that your intent is the norm, the accepted practice. And since that, whoever decided the norm is irrelevant, but because that became the market practice, so therefore we fall back that was your intent and that was your meaning and so on. So, but let's assume that there isn't that market practice. So it's just a matter that you said that I'm going to give it to you, and is that enough? Because you're holding the deed, and sort of you're releasing it by saying it. Is that enough? And that now it's too late, or do we say no? I didn't really mean it, and there wasn't really any formal type of transaction at the moment that I said it. And therefore I should be able to retract. Because ultimately, really what I owed you was cash, not the bungalow car, not the bungalow.
Right. Well,
so it's just like a momentary.
But you started with the premise, which I thought was very elegant. This is a misfit. You paid someone. And in that context, don't expect to have an emotional reversal of decision. And so if we're crossing over a line, I see, between the interpersonal and the formal.
As many ethical questions do. Yeah. Again, both parties are agreeing to do what's the right thing. So it's not a matter. The question is, what is the right thing?
Absolutely give it back.
Absolutely give it back. Why? You have to say why. Let me just say I want to say a principle in general. Every law, and it doesn't make a difference if it's legal law or ethical guiding, has to have a rationale. And you have to understand the rationale of every law, because otherwise you don't apply it properly. Because cases could slightly vary. If you understand the principle, then you know how to apply it. If you don't understand the principle, you can take the law and apply it actually counter to the intent of the law. So what's the reason? Why would you give it back?
Because the transaction was about lending money and returning money. The collateral was an extra. It's just it's there, but if there's an extreme situation that somebody drops dead, or they prove what happened in Surfside, or something happens, they're reimbursed. But otherwise, you're lending somebody money and you get it back.
So let me just throw a counter argument. So how long do you have to wait to get it back?
You gave the
I gave a short period.
Days. Yes,
but if it was 30 days or 3 years, at what point?
3 years, I think, is then they've been there.
Oh, okay.
And
now, okay, that's a different.
That's a different.
So now you're adding a caveat. They've been there and enjoyed it, which means they have expressed. They've possessed it. Okay, good. That's a good word. But let's take possessed it out, just the time period. In other words, they didn't actually use it. Corona didn't allow them to go there. Whatever the reason is, doesn't matter. But it was a longer period than 3 days. Would that still?
I think so.
You think so? Okay, fair enough. I just want to hear it. Anybody disagree?
I think the time should be written into the.
Well, there was no written things. But things that are written, there's no problems. When you write out all the details and the small print, obviously you avoid all these problems. This was all verb. Obviously, there was a deed rewritten. That was written, but the details of what's going to happen in a case of default and so on, that obviously wasn't written out. Yeah.
I think from a legal perspective, there'd be no reason to give it back. Because the loan was given, you have plenty of time during the loan to understand the ramifications of that. However, you also said it's a college.
Well, wait. Let me understand this first part. I don't mean to interrupt. Legally, you don't have to give it back, that you're saying.
Right.
I'm not so sure about that. By any real estate lawyers, again, it's my amateur understanding is that even when you take let's say a mortgage, or you take out a car loan, maybe a car loan is different, and there's a lien on the house. If you default, it doesn't automatically go to the bank. There's a legal process. They have to go to court and they have to foreclose and so on. There's stages. So that means it's not automatically the day comes, you don't pay, it belongs to the other person.
Well,
Even legally, even secular law.
legally, for instance, if you live in a condo and you defaulted on your assessment, what you get is you get a notification of intent to file a lien, then you file a lien, then you go to the foreclosure process.
Which takes a
But
long.
they have to define.
Right, but the point being is that it doesn't happen automatically.
But you have a contract here. It's like saying, suppose I gave away a watch as collateral. It was worth $2,000. Gave a $2,000 loan. If I default on, I had to pay back a certain time. If I default on payment, it's like going to a pawn shop. It's no longer yours. Legally,
A pawn shop, I believe,
that's like
has a written black and white. And that is the common practice of a pawn shop.
contracts are just enforceable. So I think from a legal perspective, you don't have.
Okay, we'll see.
But the other part is that you said this is a college.
Cal.
Now there's a personal aspect as well. It's kind of like the saying is that if you loan a friend $20, he doesn't pay you back. You well spent money. You know something about this.
But how about $2,000?
But in a situation like this, if
You can
it's a
afford to
colleague-
make a loan. That's the rule of thumb.
If this is a colleague, it's somebody in your community, and they come to you, let's say within a month, they found the money. They say, God, I found the money. I could do this. There's sort of a moral sort of thing to colleague. You would bend the legal aspect and say, instead of saying it's no longer, you're not going to enforce that.
So you're half agreeing with her. You're saying from a social perspective, you want to call it ethical, a social perspective, give it back. Legally, those black and white, you don't have to give it back. She's saying you do have to, because she's saying collateral doesn't mean that you want the collateral. It's really about the money. The collateral is just there as some form of security in case something happens that you can't get the money back. So you're half agreeing. Anybody else? Yeah.
I guess I'm looking at it from a perspective that I remember in my family. My father would play cards, and sometimes high-stake cards. And one evening, they were with friends, and everyone knew the rules of the game, and my father won tavern from the fellow who hosted the game. And I remember he came home and he talked about it. He said, he had the deed for the tavern. And we said, so we were relatively young. We said, so what are you going to do? And he said, I'm going to hold on to this for 3 days. And I'm going to go back and see my friend and tell him if I ever see or hear of him in another game, I will call the deed and I will have witnesses to that. Because he said he needs to make a living, and that's important. And he's an ethical man, and so am I. And more than that, he was a kind man, and I think kindness comes into this at some point. And so I don't know quite how you could play that out in this, but I think
So
kindness plays a
the
role.
example is a very interesting example, but it doesn't apply here.
Why not?
Why not? Anybody want to guess why not? I'll explain. I think it's a beautiful example, but there's a simple reason why.
Except because it's his livelihood.
No, no.
Well,
It
it's
wasn't alone, it was a
supporting
game of chance.
It was a game of chance.
And I
That's-
understand that too.
In other words, therefore, in Jewish law, you're not allowed to game like that. It's
Okay.
actually a prohibition. It's a form of theft in Jewish law. To gamble is a form of theft in Jewish law. Why? Exactly for this reason. Because everybody playing intends to win. So they don't really want to let go of the money, and there's really no justification but the fact that you won for the other person to take your money. So you're giving it begrudgingly. It's a form of forced transaction, and therefore it's a form of theft. Here we're talking about there's a loan. So you gave the other person the money, and you're taking the collateral as payment. So that's fair and square. In other words, we're not talking, you're not taking anything that's not owed to you. The question is collateral or cash. It could be retracting. That's why it's not similar, although the emotional aspect
The
is similar.
emotional aspect and the kindness piece could come in there, I would assume, but I could be wrong on that. And I guess I had a suspicion that in Jewish law that might have been the case, but I'm not of that faith, so.
I think it's like giving a person a fish or teaching them how to fish.
Well, that's in her.
Your
That's, okay,
example.
that's yeah. Okay. Anybody else?
Uh,
Well, anybody else want? Nobody else? Okay, good.
Well, I have another example of this, which again is strictly legal. My brother is a CPA, and when he was younger, and he was working for one of the, at that time, big 8 accounts. He was auditing a company, and he found that somebody had been embezzling money. And in fact, the person did the books, so the books with the evidence was the last thing that he was doing. And he confronted the person, he said, "You authorized this?" The person said, "I did." He said, "You're not authorized to do that." He said, "Yes, I know. I embezzled the money." And he reported to the company.
Your brother reported.
And the company talked to apparently a person who was doing it had been a long-time employee. He had a drinking problem. And the company said, "Well, here's the deal. You know the amount you embezzled. We have to pay it back over, I forget what period of time, it was a year or 2 years, out of your salary. You have to go to
Rehab.
Anonymous on a regular basis. And if you remain a good employee, well, forget about it. If you miss any meeting of AA, you're turning over state's evidence." And as far as I know, that's what was done. So there's a legal item. Legal issues, you can throw them in jail, but the company is something I can do. The same thing, you know, you have this problem, understand it, but you correct it.
Right. Okay, but in this case, there was no addiction. There was no gambling. It's just a matter of you couldn't pay it initially. Is your word a word? Is your word binding, or not? That's really the question. Okay, so what I want to do is, because we're very limited in time, is go through some of the sources. But before we start with the sources, I just want to establish, as an introduction to the issue, what is the status of collateral within Jewish law? Now, really, we can spend many classes discussing, because it's a very in-depth subject and many different opinions and rationales. But I just want to highlight one point, at least as a starter, that there's actually a verse in Leviticus, and it's repeated later in Deuteronomy as well, that if you offer a loan, and the example of in scripture is to a poor person, because obviously they don't have what to pay back, and they give you collateral. Now, we're not getting in when they offered you the collateral, initially at the loan or later at the due date. It does make a difference, but we're not going to get into it. But they offered you collateral. What kind of collateral could they offer you? If it's a poor person, usually it's things that are part of the necessities.
Service.
Not service. Service is not collateral, because there's no way to force the person. But you offer them, what do you have in the house? Your mattress, your pillow, whatever the basic necessities are. Scripturally, there's actually an obligation to return it on a daily basis to the poor person so that they could have what to sleep in, or they could have what to wear if they gave clothing off their back. What you see from that scriptural text is that collateral, although it's a form of security, but it doesn't automatically transfer ownership at the due date. Now, what the status is and how much right do you have to it, that's, again, a matter of discussion, and it's an in-depth subject to discuss. But I just wanted to bring that as the beginning of this conversation, because that does tie into what you mentioned earlier, that it's a form of security, but it doesn't actually fully, at least not fully, belong to you. And actually, just to give you another source, although it's not exactly applied here, but if this is number 1 on the sheet. The following rule applies when a person gives a loan to a colleague and takes security in return. So now you have the collateral. What is the lender's responsibility towards this collateral? What if something happens to the collateral? So there's a dispute, but Maimonides rules, according to the opinion, he is considered to be a paid watchman. Now, what kind of payment is he getting for this? The fact that he's not getting any payment, I mean, he gave him a loan, and he's getting back. He's not getting any interest. So why is he considered a paid watchman? Because he did a mitzvah. So the mitzvah it's a form of payment. It's a spiritual payment, according to this opinion. Now, accordingly, since he's considered a paid watchman, if the security is lost or stolen, he is responsible for his value. So let me just say very briefly, there are 3 types of guardians. There is a voluntary guardian, which means an unpaid custodian. There's a paid custodian, and then there is a borrower. And the basic difference between all the 3 is the unpaid custodian is doing the person a favor without any return. There is no self-benefit from this relationship. It's purely a favor. The person that's being paid, so both of them are benefiting. The person being paid is getting paid for watching it, but the person that owns the item is also benefiting that somebody's watching their item. So it's a shared benefit. A borrower, the borrower is the one that has 100% of the benefit because they borrowed an item, they're not paying for it. So the person that owns it, that loaned them the item, has no benefit. You're just giving the person the item on loan. The borrower is the one that has full benefit. So therefore, the level of responsibility differs. An unpaid custodian, because they're doing it as a favor, therefore they're only responsible for neglect. But beyond neglect, they're not responsible. So therefore, if it's stolen or if it's lost not by neglect, so they're not responsible. Definitely, if there was something beyond, unforeseen circumstances, for sure they're not. Like an accident, they're not responsible. A paid custodian has a higher level of responsibility. So of course, neglect. But what if it gets stolen? They still have responsibility to pay for it. But if it's an accident beyond their control, then they don't have to pay for it. A borrower, on the other hand, because they have 100% benefit, and the lender has no benefit in this relationship, therefore they actually assume ownership of the item during this period, and therefore whatever happens, you have to return the item. So it doesn't make sense why the item is not in its original state. It could be by accident. It makes no difference. You still have to return the item. So therefore, understanding the relationship to the collateral is understanding what level of responsibility. So since it's only like a paid custodian, if it was stolen, then you have to pay back the collateral or deduct it from the original loan. But what if an accident happened beyond your control? If the security was lost because of causes beyond the lender's control, for example, it was taken by armed thieves or the like, the lender must take an oath that it was lost due to forces beyond his control, and the owner of the security must repay his debt until the last pruta. He has to pay till the last penny, basically. So in other words, what you see from here as well is that you don't take possession of the collateral. It's still, and the proof is because if it's an accident, then it's not your responsibility. You still have to pay back the loan. Okay, so this is an introduction to understand that collateral in Jewish law does not mean that you automatically take possession at the due date. It's just, at least generally, it's a form of security to guarantee that you will be paid back. Okay, so now the question over here in our example is, it doesn't automatically transfer, even though you signed the deed to actually give him the collateral so he has it in his possession, but it doesn't automatically transfer. The question is, by you telling the person, take collateral in place of payment, does that verbal transfer, does that actually carry value or not? Okay, that's the question. So what we're going to see now in the Talmudic sources, we're going to see 3 examples. And by examining these 3 examples and their similarity, their differences, and how you explain the rationale of their differences, I don't want to be too complex, it will determine how we apply it to our case. So what are the 3 examples? I'll just say it first out, the idea, and then we'll see it inside. One example that the Talmud offers is you have 2 people that own property, and in between their property, let's say in between their yard, their garden, there's some type of a wall, whether a brick wall or a wood, it doesn't make a difference, some type of barrier. And this wall one day collapses, but it falls over into your neighbor's property. So let's say it's not just the matter that it's a nuisance, it's actually preventing you from using that area for planting or whatever it is. So you knock on your neighbor's door and you say, your wall just fell into my property, please remove it, right? That's the right thing to do, remove the thing. So the owner of the wall responds, you can keep it. Now think of it, not in modern times where everything's replaceable, you throw it out and you go to Home Depot, you buy a new one. In ancient times, they would recycle it. So the same wood would be reused, the same bricks would be reused. Everything was, you had to create it from scratch, so you would reuse everything. So by saying keep it, it was actually valuable. It was something of value. So basically you say keep it. So it's not mine anymore. I'm giving it to you, it's yours, do what you want. I don't have to remove it. Now the question is, could you retract on that? Could you come and say, I'll remove it, or if you removed it, I'll pay you for the effort that it was to remove it, but I want my material back. Could you retract or not? So the Talmud says, simple reading of the Talmud, is that you could, if you said keep it, you could retract. You can come tomorrow and say, I'll take it back, I'll clean it up, it's mine. I didn't really mean what I said. I would just procrastinate. I wanted to buy time, so to speak. But if the other person actually removed it already, and then you come and say, give it back to me, and I'll pay you for the labor that it took to remove it, I'll pay you for the time. If they actually removed it, at that point, you can't retract it. Why? Because they did some form of taking possession of it, some form of acquisition, and now it belongs to them. Okay, so that's example number 1. There are details in that we'll see. That's example number 1. We'll call that the example of the wall. Okay? Example number 2 that the Talmud offers. And that is employer-employee relationship. So you hire somebody to harvest your field, whatever it should be. The example is usually things that are not of great value. So we're not talking about avocados. We're talking about just some hay or something of that sort that's really very cheap. And he finishes his day of work. He comes for payment, and you tell him, just keep what you harvested for yourself. Could you retract and say, oh, here's cash and give me back my harvest, or not? So here, again, we'll see soon. Here what we find is, according to many opinions, that it's different. Soon we'll see why. If you say no, I want cash, then obviously you didn't accept it, so the other guy can get back his material. But if you accept it, you said, okay, I'll take it. And you didn't have to do anything, but it's already in your property, it's in your possession already. Then you cannot retract. So in the wall, until you actually gather it, you could retract it. In the case of employee, the moment the other person accepted it and it's already in their property, even though they didn't do anything to formally exhibit possession of it, you can't retract. Yeah.
In your possession and in your property seem like two different.
I mean in your property. In your
Okay.
I don't mean in possession, I mean you took it, you did anything. I hear what you're saying, but in Jewish law, it's either you acquired it, which means you did some type of act of acquisition, versus, or like I said, you possessed it, but it was an act of possessing it, or it's just in your property by default. In other words, it happens to be that it's in, it was, let's say, your tractor, and it's sitting in your tractor, or whatever it should be, that it's you didn't do an act of acquisition, it's just in your property. So this is according to most opinions, that there are two different examples. Now, some opinions say that in both examples, you could retract unless some type of possessing it took place, some type of acquisition took place. But according, as we'll see, to most opinions, they're different. Now the question is, a third example, similar to the example that we had, which is collateral. Okay, which is you loan somebody money, the due date comes, he doesn't have what to pay, he tells you back, keep it. Right? Could you retract or not? Very similar to our case that we said. The question is, do we compare it to the wall? Which then means you could retract because there was no formal act of possessing it. Excuse me, or do we compare it to the employee and we say, no, the moment you agreed to accept it as payment, you can't retract. And therefore, the moment I said, take the collateral, take the bungalow, and you said, fine, great, that's it, you can't retract. What do we do with this thing? What do we compare it to? Okay, so we need to understand the logic. Before we get to the collateral, we need to understand the logic of the wall, the logic of the employee, and based on that, what we can compare the collateral to. Are we following so far? Yeah. I should have made a chart, but that's what it is. Okay, so let's see the sources before we get to the rationale. Let's see the sources inside. So number 2 on the sheet. One whose wall was adjacent to another's garden, and the wall fell, and the owner of the garden said to him, clear away your stones. And the owner of the stones said to him, they are yours, as I hereby declare them ownerless, and you can take them for yourself. The court does not listen to him, since he cannot force the other to acquire the stones. In other words, it's not ownerless, and you still have the responsibility to remove your stones. If after the owner of the garden voluntarily accepted ownership of the stones upon himself, the owner of the wall said to him, here you are, take your expenditures for the removal of the stones, and I will take the stones that are mine. The court does not listen to him, as they had already been acquired by the owner of the garden. Okay, that's case number 1. We'll soon see details in this case as well. Case number 2, number 3 on the sheet. One who hires a laborer to do work with him, with hay or with straw, and after he finishes the task, the laborer said to the employer, give me my wages. And the employer said to him, take what you have worked with as your wages, meaning take some of the hay and straw as payment. The court does not listen to him. You have to pay him in cash. Now, why do you have to pay him in cash? I mean, this is also valid. This is also worth money, because that was the assumed agreement that I'm going to be paid in cash. But if after the laborer accepted upon himself to keep the hay and the straw as payment, the employer changed his mind and said to him, here you are, take your wages, and I will take what is mine, the court does not listen to him since the laborer had already acquired the hay. So these are two cases. Now the Talmud analyzes these two cases. So number 4, one whose wool, right, the first case, the wool. So the Talmud says like this, but from the fact that the last clause of the Mishnah teaches that if the owner of the fallen wool says, here you are, take your expenditures, the court does not listen to them. It can be understood by inference that we are dealing with a case where the owner of the garden cleared away the stones. In the first case, what happened? The wool fell, you said, take away your stones. The owner of the stone said, keep it, right? So initially, if you said, I don't want it, then he can't force you to keep it. But if you agreed, then you can't retract. But if you look carefully at the wording of the Mishnah, it didn't say if you agreed, you can't retract. If he came and said, here are your expenditures and give me back my stones, he can't retract. What does it mean? Here are your expenditures. What does that imply? That implies that there was expenditures. What were the expenditures? Labor, removal of the stones. So in other words, in the first case, even though it doesn't say it explicitly, but it wasn't just that he agreed to accept the stones, but there was actual removal of the stones, meaning he took possession of the stones. And then the Talmud says that he can't retract. What would be if he didn't take possession of the stones? He just agreed. It seems like he could still retract. That's what the Talmud is saying. Let's see that inside again. It can therefore be deduced that the reason the owner of the fallen wool cannot retract this offer is that the owner of the garden cleared them away. But if he did not clear them away, the stones are not considered his, and they remain in his possession, in the possession of the owner of the wool. So the Talmud immediately asks, why? Why is agreement to accept the stones not enough? Why does he have to actually take possessions? Now, why should it be enough? So let's see now. Why? Why do they remain in the possession of the owner of the wool if he didn't actually remove them yet? But shouldn't the owner of the garden's field affect acquisition of the stones on his behalf? As Rabbi Yosef, son of Rabbi Hanina, says, the courtyard of a person affects acquisition for him of those items that enter it, even without his knowledge. Now, what does this mean? What happens if you find an item that's ownerless? An example of an item that's ownerless that you don't have the obligation to return would be loose money, right? There's no way to identify that it's yours. You find loose money, finders keepers, even in Jewish law, right? What happens if I find it in somebody else's property? For example, you're staying at someone's house, you find loose, and you ask them, is it theirs? And they say it's not. So it's not, it wasn't there. The easiest example would be outside. If it's inside, you might try to retrace who was at the house. Outside, there's no way to know, and there's no way to prove that it was yours. But it's in somebody else's yard. Is it theirs? Or is it yours? They didn't know about it. So there are different conditions, but generally we say that your property by default acquires things for you. If it's in your property, it's yours. That's what this law is saying. So the question of the Talmud is, the stones fell into this person's garden. If he says, I don't want it, so you can't force something upon somebody. But if he agreed to accept it, why does he have to possess it? Why isn't it enough that it's in his property and he agreed to it, that his property acquires it for him? That's the question of the Talmud. What does the Talmud answer? This statement applies only in a case where the giver intends to transfer them to him. In which case, the field can affect acquisition of the stones for the receiver without an additional act of acquisition. But here, the owner of the fallen wall is seeking only to evade the owner of the garden. So all of a sudden, we introduce now a new principle. and this is important to understand. The intent of the original owner. Did they mean what they say? Or were they just trying to buy time? If they did not mean what they say, then you can't acquire it. You might want to acquire it, you might agree to acquire it, but they never gave up ownership. They never actually gave it away. So we have to examine the intent of the original owner. Did they actually mean what they say? Or were they just playing with you and trying to buy time? And this becomes the key factor. So now, let's go to the second case. And then we'll see how we apply this here, yeah?
I'm disturbed about what you said earlier, a few minutes ago, when you said in Jewish law, it's finders keepers. I don't agree with that at all. It's not yours.
It depends what. Depends what. If it's money or anything that doesn't have an identifying mark or any way to identify it, then we assume that the original owner gave up any hope of ever retrieving it.
Somebody drops their change purse.
Well, that's different. A purse is an identifying mark.
No, it's got nothing but a zipper.
It
and a
doesn't
little
have to be, but
compartment.
it has a color, it has a size, it has identifying mark. That's why I said loose change. There's no way to retract where I lost it. And even if I retract where I lost it, there's no way of the person finding and giving it to me. So the assumption, and again, you have to know that the person knew that they lost and the assumption is they gave up all hope, which means they rendered it ownerless. Now, again, we can discuss this a little bit, but
Okay.
that's a whole
It's not yours.
chapter in called Elam Mitzvot. These are the laws of finding that deals with when not. If you want to give it back, that's the form of a gift, but it doesn't. They don't have no right to it in any way or form.
It's just not yours. That's all. Not yours.
So what do you do if you find $100 bill in the middle of the street? And let's make it a little bit more private. I just took my children to Hershey Park last week, and I took them on a day that I believed that it'll be empty on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. It was more full than the busiest season. Literally, there was no room to walk. You had to stand in line for 3 hours.
Oh.
Now imagine you find $100 bill in the middle of Hershey Park. What do you do now? You can decide to leave it and the guy behind you will pick it up. you can decide to pick it up and give it to charity. That's your choice, but it's charity.
No,
You can be.
I think you notify somebody who works at Hershey Park, lost and found, and say, look, I found this. If somebody says they lost it, I have yours.
And if nobody said, and if nobody said they lost it,
Well,
3 weeks pass and nobody said they lost it.
Then it's yours.
Oh, so then you do agree. There's a point.
So
So
I think you have to give a reasonable, it's not yours.
it becomes by definition in Jewish law ownerless. The moment there is no way to identify and prove that it's yours.
But if you made a concerted effort to give it back to its rightful owner, then I think your conscience is pretty clear.
Okay, we'll talk about it a different time maybe about this. Yeah.
Question about this example. So your wall falls in my garden and it's like the day I'm gonna start planting my harvest, but you're not home. So I clean up the bricks, the stones. Are they mine? Because like my livelihood depended on me cleaning them.
You can't say that the bricks are yours. What you can ask is for the labor of cleaning it up.
But you can only ask.
There's an obligation.
Okay.
There's an obligation that they're obligated to now. If they don't want it, you'll take them to small claims court or in Jewish law to rabbinical court, and you have a right to remove that and request payment if they don't or they're not around to do it for you.
So can the payment be just the material still, or?
So then if the court, again, so that's already given, if the court rules that they should pay you. You're not paying, so then it comes a certain point where they will go and find whatever valuable of theirs to pay up whatever they owe you. But that's at the end if they're not paying in the court. But here we're talking about if you are going to come back and pay them, right?
Yeah.
So you want back the material. Okay, so let's we're very limited in time, so I'm gonna talk just outside. Now, the second case of the employee. In the second case of the employee, we don't have this clause where you tell the person, here is payment for your expenditures. Right? We don't have that example. So in other words, according to most opinions, they differentiate that in a case of the wall, when do you acquire it? Only if you did an act of acquisition. And if you didn't do an act of acquisition, meaning if you didn't remove the stones, then just agreeing to accept it is not enough. But in the case of employee, it's enough if you agree to accept it. You don't have to do an act of acquisition. Why the difference? Okay, so what we do have is one guiding principle, which is in the case of the wall, the person didn't actually intend to give you the material, they were just trying to buy time. But how about in the case of the employee? So there are different ways to understand the difference. And again, because of limitation of time, we'll just choose one for now. And that is that in the case of the wall, you don't owe the person anything yet. Yeah, you owe them, you have to remove your stones, but you don't owe them anything yet, right? Therefore, when you're saying take it, at that time, you don't owe them anything. You don't owe them the material. The same thing is also that you don't assume the moment you say take it, they're going to take it right away. Most people are going to, okay, when I'll get around to it, I'll do it. So by definition, it's not an immediate, doesn't take immediate effect. Therefore, in such a case, we can assume that you're buying time, meaning you're pushing it off when he will remove it, till he'll remove it, and so on. But in the case of an employee, you owe them something. You have to pay the employee unless otherwise agreed upon that day, before nightfall. You owe them money that day. So therefore, when you told them, keep the hay as payment, you told it to them at a time that at that time you owe them the money. Therefore, when you said it, we assume you meant it, because you owe them the labor, you owe them the pay. And that's why in that case, they don't have to take possession. Again, why? Because we focus on the intent of the giver. If we can say that you just try to postpone it, then he doesn't take acquisition by default, even if he agreed. If we say that his intent was to give it, why? In this case, because he owes him something, then he did intend to give it to him, and therefore he takes immediate possession the moment he agreed to do that. Now, if we take this train of thought, what would be the case of collateral? Does he owe him or does he not owe him? It's past the due date. He owes him. So therefore, the assumption would be, if we take this train of thought, would be that the moment he said, keep the collateral, you meant it. Because you owe him, if we go with this train of thought. And therefore, you wouldn't be able to retract. It should be similar to what Ken is saying, but nothing in Judaism is so simple. And here's the problem. In the Code of Jewish law, and you look at the sources, you'll see it later. Code of Jewish law says like this: the case of the wall, it doesn't happen by default. You have to do an act of acquisition, right? Because we say the intent was just to postpone it. In the case of an employee, if the hay happens to be in the property of the employee and he agreed to accept it, it's his, even though there was no act of acquisition. It happens by default, right? It makes sense what we just said. But when we come to the case of collateral, Code of Jewish law says that even if it's in his possession already, you can retract, unless he did an act of acquisition. Which means all of a sudden collateral becomes similar to the wall, not to the employee. Why? So I'll say it myself. I mean, just because of limitation of time. It's a question that many commentaries remain with a question. It seems to be that collateral should be similar to employee, where you owe him something at the time, and not to the wall, where you don't owe him anything yet. You owe him removal, but you don't owe him money. So why do we say that you can retract until you actually take until you do a formal acquisition of the collateral. So I found one answer that's brought by two commentaries. And they say that they explain the difference the following. There is something unique to an employee that doesn't apply to the wall, neither to collateral. There is a certain urgency in the case of employee that doesn't exist neither in the case of the wall and neither in the case of collateral. And therefore, and I'll explain a second what that urgency is. And that's why, because in the other two cases, there's no urgency, we say he's just trying to buy time. But in the case of employee, there's an urgency, and therefore you can't make the argument that he's buying time. What is that urgency? So if you look, and I already mentioned it earlier, but if you look on the source sheet, in source 11 and 12, there is a biblical obligation to pay your employee on that day. If it's a day employee, you have to pay him before nightfall. If it's a night employee, you have to pay him before daybreak. If not, you violated a biblical obligation. It's a transgression. Therefore, we assume, because of this urgency, that the employer doesn't want to transgress. They have an urgency. It's an immediate thing. It's at the end of the day, you have to pay. How much time do you have left? Therefore, when they said it, they meant it. And therefore, only in the case of employee do we say the intent was literal, and therefore, if the other party agreed, they bought it, then you can't retract. In the case of the wall, there's no biblical obligation when to remove it. You have to remove it, but there's no, and the same is with the case of the loan. Of course, you have to repay the loan, but if you don't pay on time, it's not morally acceptable, but you're not violating it. It's not a transgression. And therefore, there's no urgency. And therefore, in both of those cases, we say, you didn't really mean it. You're just trying to buy time. And therefore, until there was no formal act of acquisition, which actually makes it concrete, concretizes it, then we say it was just, I said it, but I didn't mean it. And therefore, when I come to you with cash, I can actually retract it. So in the case of the bungalow, I said it, but I didn't mean it. And then there's another aspect as well. In the case of the Talmud, we're talking about collateral that's in my property. So we could make an argument, does my property acquire it for me by default or not? If I agree, does the property acquire it? In the bungalow, it's not in my property. It's not its property. It's not in my property. So you can't even make that argument. So therefore, it seems, again, we're not saying anything definitive, but it seems that in the case of collateral, definitely real estate collateral, if you said keep it as form of payment and you come back in a reasonable time, we're not going to get into how long the time is, and you offer to pay the original understood payment, which is cash, then you can actually retract it and get your bungalow back. Any questions? Yes.
What happens to the person that moved into the bungalow?
That's a form of acquisition.
Yeah.
That's a form of acquisition. That actually exhibited that you took possession of it. So there are different things. You don't always have to, you can even just change the lock on the door. It's a form of acquisition. If you did a formal form of acquisition, then even on the wall, if I took the stones or wood, that's a form of acquisition. There is a dispute. Do I have to take possession with the knowledge of the original owner, meaning that they know about it, or it doesn't make a difference? The moment they told me take it and I actually took it is enough. Okay, that's already a separate discussion and deviates a little bit from what we're going to talk about, from what we spoke about today. But that's what seems to be, again, based. So it's very important to understand what the principle of the law is, and then how do you apply a similar case? Do you apply it? And here you see the example of understanding the principle behind it, of how you would apply collateral to the wall or to the employee and the differences that. And this is just, by the way, I shortened it for you. So this is just a short version, but just give you a little bit of a taste of how the process works, of how we develop application of Jewish law. Tomorrow is historical sketches, which is given by my wife, and if maybe she wants to explain what it is. She said last time I didn't define it properly.
Tomorrow we're going to examine the pogroms of Chmelnytsky.
Say that again.
The Chmelnytsky pogroms.
And its effect on the Jewish communities. Okay, thank you so much.